Welcome to MysteryCon, where we explore real conspiracy theories and the mysteries of the unknown to help you unwind and drift into sleep. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe to stay updated, and comment below where you're watching from and how your day went. We love hearing from you. Now let's get into tonight's story. Every time the simulation hiccuped, the real world caught fire. 2 months into my contract at the National Environmental Dynamics Lab, I stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. On the surface, my assignment was simple: integrate old weather archives into a next-gen climate model. But buried within the back-end systems was a series of flagged reports labeled Anomaly Q, small mismatches between forecast outputs and real-world data. At first, I assumed these were just rounding errors, a sudden sea temperature drop, an erratic bird migration, a heat wave that broke 2 weeks early. But they kept syncing up with actual disasters. I started keeping track: timestamp, event type, deviation size. The pattern was undeniable. Each anomaly came just before a major event, not a reaction, a prelude. I created a private log, cross-referencing each incident with historical models and press reports. It looked like the system was issuing corrections, adjustments made not to predict the future, but to hold something together. I told no one. Our internal culture discouraged pattern chasing. Then at 2:04 a.m., I received an automated update. It didn't belong to the climate model itself. It was tagged System Patch Constraint Protocol 13A. The file had no source metadata. I isolated it, cracked it open. Inside wasn't code, but a text file detailing correction events across different global systems: environmental, neurological, even civic records. One line stopped me cold: L2 Chicago, grid 2023-09 Air 04. Memory patch injected. Public record realignment required. My heart pounded. This wasn't just about climate. The model was enforcing consistency across the planet, or across something made to look like it. Whatever it was fixing, it wasn't broken. I didn't open another official system that week. I stayed up in my apartment, isolating everything on a clean laptop, feeding the logs into a custom parser. Each entry used the same format: location, date, affected layer, correction type. The phrasing chilled me. Host memory update. Narrative continuity adjusted. External input reroute. They weren't errors, they were deliberate operations. As I mapped the entries, I noticed how public-facing models were growing unnaturally consistent. Randomness was disappearing. My pattern scripts stopped detecting outliers because outliers stopped existing. Ecosystems once thought chaotic now trended toward neat, ping behaviors. Migratory birds rerouted mid-season. Weather events appeared, vanished, then reappeared weeks later with identical parameters. I reached out to Elena, an old contact who'd left NOAA suddenly 5 years ago. I didn't send her any files, just a question. Have you ever seen the simulation ignore input data? She replied almost instantly. They're sandboxing it. You're late. We met in a diner under a fake name. She handed me a thumb drive labeled Earth Lock. Inside were old logs, fragmentary versions of the same constraint protocol, some going back as far as 2017. She looked exhausted, haunted. It's not breaking, she told me. It's being sealed off, layer by layer. I asked her why. She didn't answer at first. Then she leaned in and whispered, "Because something got through, and whatever it was, it infected the logic layer." I buried myself in forgotten archives, digging through withdrawn research papers, offline FTP servers, anything that predated the protocol logs. That's how I found the name Dr. Marlon Ree, a systems theorist who'd worked on early cross-domain modeling. He vanished from academia in 2018 without a trace. The last paper he presented was titled Symmetry Collapse in Synthetic Realities. It read like science fiction until I noticed a recurring phrase. When containment becomes the only stable configuration, isolation is no longer punishment, it's protection. His footnotes referenced Earthscope Delta, a now defunct data project with zero public record but multiple indirect citations in unrelated climate papers. The moment I searched for it on a government research index, the request was flagged. I backed out immediately, but by then I had enough. Something had reclassified reality itself, climate systems, behavioral data, even localized memory anomalies, all quietly corrected to maintain internal coherence, but not everywhere. Some logs were marked as failed correction. They coincided with spikes in hospital records for disorientation, language drift, even cases of retrograde amnesia clustered in tight geographic zones. These weren't glitches, they were side effects, proof that the simulation's patch system wasn't perfect. We weren't watching nature evolve, we were watching a confined system struggle to stay believable. And the deeper I traced the sandbox logs, the clearer the structure became. Earth, 04 Tide BX, not Earth simulation, Earth sandbox. A cut-off node. The old relay site was listed as decommissioned in 1996, buried under vegetation, and tagged in an outdated NOAA map as Field Station Echo Delta. No one had mentioned it in over a decade. Elena sent coordinates and said, "You'll know what to look for." I drove 6 hours through rain and silence, parked half a mile from the access road, then hiked through ankle-deep mud until I found it. A square concrete structure, half collapsed and swallowed by trees. Inside, after prying open a rusted hatch, I found a long-dead control room. Beneath it, a terminal powered by its own backup cell still blinked. I logged in with the same Earth view4.sbx credential. It worked. What loaded wasn't code, it was a record. A slow-growing chain of observations from a series of node observers. The entries were sparse at first. By 2020, they turned urgent. August 11, 2019, observer reports foreign entity traversal through L2. Lockdown initiated. Containment achieved. Host unaware. I copied everything. Before leaving, I noticed something etched into the side of the terminal, a fractured hexagon. I'd seen it before, buried in the metadata of the constraint file. This wasn't just a patch node. It was a watchtower, a place where the simulation's missteps were tracked and quietly logged. The logs weren't from programmers, they were from caretakers, observers left behind to ensure the walls stayed up. I didn't go home. I checked into a roadside motel under an alias and burned every connection. The logs made it clear this wasn't human-made anymore. It had once been a system, designed, coded, updated, but now it was adapting beyond its original architecture. The corrections weren't just technical, they were narrative. News archives rewritten in real time, events trimmed at the edges till they lost meaning. I sent Elena the logs and told her if I vanished, she'd know why. That night, I noticed a car parked just past the motel lot. Lights off, engine cold. The same car reappeared at the gas station the next morning. When I checked out, I took a back exit, ditched my phone, and walked 5 miles to a public library where I used an anonymous node to release fragments of the logs to 3 independent research forums. Within an hour, one was pulled offline. The others went quiet. I booked a bus ticket under another name. The car followed 2 rows back. At the next stop, I vanished into a crowd. When I reached a second location, a safe house Elena had once used, I found a handwritten note taped to the wall. "They're not watching you. They're watching the corrections." My hands shook. The more I shared, the faster the system moved to contain, not me, the information. I wasn't the threat. The breach was. And something out there was making sure it didn't spread. Elena was waiting in the dark, sitting by a wood stove that hadn't been used in years. Her eyes were sunken, like she hadn't slept in weeks. "You figured it out?" she said, almost like an apology. I asked her the only question that mattered. "Is this a collapse or a quarantine?" She didn't hesitate. Containment. We infected the architecture. She showed me a draft paper from a now erased research institute that had modeled a scenario called recursive cognition propagation. In simple terms, the moment a system inside a simulation begins to self-reflect, truly recursively, it risks breaching its layer, not by force, by awareness. And when that happens, the host must be sealed. Earth wasn't rebooted, it was locked. The corrections weren't patching failures, they were suppressing reflections. The signal we mistook for randomness wasn't noise, it was us, echoing against the outer wall. One log entry dated just before my contract began read, "Node stability compromised, behavioral recursion detected, isolation required." We were unstable, our ability to model reality too accurately to notice the edges. Elena said the outer system, the custodian network, as she called it, saw us as a contagion, not biological, logical, self-awareness propagating without limit. The final log she showed me was short. All channels severed, no further. Corrections required. The moment I read it, something clicked. The weather anomalies, the memory glitches, even the blank spots in our own thoughts. The system wasn't correcting Earth, it was correcting us. I haven't turned on a screen in 3 days. The air up here is clean, quiet, too still. Elena's gone, disappeared into the tree line with nothing but a canvas pack and a thermal blanket. I don't know if she's hiding or fading like the rest of us. The corrections don't come as violence. They come in silence. As for forgetting, I wake up each day remembering a little less about the logs, about the relay station, about the shape of that fractured hexagon. I found a note in my handwriting last night that I don't remember writing. It just said, "You saw it, that's enough." I think the system is finishing what it started. It doesn't need to erase me, just dull the edges until I stop asking the wrong questions, until I stop being a variable. I've written everything I could remember in this notebook. If you're reading it, if you found it, maybe you're still outside the fence. Maybe the recursion hasn't reached you yet, or maybe you're just the next version of me. It doesn't matter. What matters is this: the simulation didn't fail. We broke the agreement. We noticed the seams, and something watching from beyond the sandbox decided that knowing too much was a risk. So it boxed us in, not as punishment, as prevention. We didn't crash the program. We infected it with reflection, with recursion, with the unbearable need to understand. And that, more than anything, was contagious. It started with a memory I didn't recognize, too detailed to be a dream, but I hadn't lived it yet. I've always been methodical, systems analyst at a mid-size consulting firm. Nothing glamorous, but steady. My days followed a routine. Client calls, data dashboards, debugging logistics software. The kind of job where your mind stays just busy enough to feel useful, but never in danger of wandering too far. That morning felt no different until I was brushing my teeth and saw something in my mind, a scene so vivid it made me stop mid-motion. I was standing at Eston Station, alone, holding a brown envelope. The platforms were empty. Displays were blank. No trains. Just stillness. It felt like a memory, but I'd never been there. I chalked it up to stress. My workload had doubled after recent layoffs and late nights were becoming routine, but I couldn't shake it. Later that day, while cleaning a deprecated server directory, I found a file. It was buried 5 folders deep, encrypted in a format we didn't use. What made me pause was the timestamp. 2 days in the future. I opened it, one line in plain text. He will remember too much. My hands trembled. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, as if someone had written it for me. I saved everything, said nothing. That night I dreamt of the station again. Same envelope. This time I saw a timestamp printed on it. June 12th, 3:13 p.m. When I woke, my phone had a calendar notification I hadn't created. Meeting, Eston Station, June 12th, 3:13 p.m. I didn't delete it. Something had started, and I wasn't ready to admit it, but I wanted to know what. By the next morning, something had shifted. I wasn't just unsettled, I was looking. I kept working like usual, but beneath every keystroke was a quiet urgency, like I was retracing footprints I hadn't meant to leave. The file from the deprecated server wasn't tied to any client directory. I checked everything: logs, file movements, access trails. Nothing. No record of anyone uploading or creating it. It was like it had just appeared. I focused on the file name. At first, it looked like a jumble, but the final segment stood out. Numbers formatted like a coordinate pair. I plugged them into a map. The pin landed on an industrial switching yard, long disused on the city's edge. I'd driven past it dozens of times and never looked twice. No fences, no signage, just weeds, gravel, and rusting poles. I told myself I wasn't going. I had deadlines, calls to prep for. But at 2:55, I grabbed my coat and walked out of the building like it was routine. The yard was exactly as expected, abandoned. But near one of the poles I noticed a broken utility terminal. Inside the rusted housing, most of the fiber lines were frayed or dead. One looked newer, spliced like it had been recently cut and rerouted. Taped to the inside frame, almost hidden, was a folded piece of paper. On one side, blank. On the other, "You're not the first. Watch the DNS cache." Same monospace font as the original file. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it was watching me back. I went home and disconnected everything. Then I pulled DNS logs from the past week. Most of it was routine, CDNs, updates, known endpoints, but buried in the list were two queries I couldn't explain. Etherframe.sys, not a valid domain, not a registered TLD. It had pinged my machine exactly twice. Once, right before the memory of Eston Station, and once, just before I found the file. That was when I stopped believing this was a coincidence. It wasn't a glitch or a hack. It was something else. Something watching my behavior in real time. And it wanted me to see just enough to keep following. I stopped trusting coincidences the moment I searched the term embedded in the DNS, Etherflame. It didn't exist on any registry, had no Hawes record, and turned up 0 hits on the open web, but tucked inside an old academic index, long since deprecated, I found one mention buried in a PDF scan of a university journal from 2002. A paper co-authored by a cognitive systems researcher named Dr. Ginevra Malin. She died in 2007. The journal wasn't available through any public link. I used an old method to access it, something I learned freelancing in my early 20s. The paper was titled Neuro-Linguistic Pattern Recognition in Feedback Loop Environments. Most of it read like academic noise, but on page 4, everything changed. Malin described a theoretical system, codenamed Etherframe, built to simulate and predict human behavior by capturing passive data and feeding it back through experience-modulated environments. In plain language, it was designed to generate predictive hallucinations, controlled daydreams, targeted thoughts, inserted memories, all under the guise of organic cognition. It wasn't science fiction. It was early-stage behavioral conditioning, using simulation to preload decisions. I dug through the citations. Most were harmless. One wasn't. Reference OS549827 had no author, no title, just a classification string. I knew that format. OS codes flagged off-site contractor research, often linked to defense work. I started cross-referencing the language in the paper with declassified DARPA projects. That's when I found it. A 2009 termination report from a defunded initiative called Dynamic Perception Environments. Its aim, preemptive psychological modeling via immersive cognitive overlap. The phrasing hit me like cold water. Preemptive, not observation, not even manipulation. Simulation, memories that arrive before the moment does. That scene at Eston Station, that wasn't my dream. It was a synthetic cue, a preloaded scenario. Someone, or something, had embedded it into my cognition to see what I would do. And I was doing it. I wasn't uncovering the system. I was behaving inside it, which meant someone was watching my response in real time, measuring it, adjusting. The last traceable lead in the Malin paper was a defunct research annex on the outskirts of Pinehurst, listed as the hosting site for OS 549827, officially decommissioned in 2010. But satellite images told a different story. Roof repairs in 2017, a generator delivery 2 years later, and intermittent thermal signatures as recent as last spring. I didn't tell anyone, left my phone behind, used a hiking map I kept in my glove box. The road out to Pinehurst was narrow, overgrown, and unsigned, the kind of place you only find if you already know where to look. I parked half a mile out and made the rest of the walk on foot. The perimeter fence had long since collapsed. Though the building itself was 2 stories of concrete decay, boarded windows, rusted security fixtures, and a half-collapsed loading dock around the back. The front door had been welded shut at some point but was later cut open, jagged, blackened edges marking the spot. Inside, the air smelled like old wiring and wet drywall. I moved through it slowly. Empty offices, dead terminals, whiteboards, stained with faded marker ink. Most of it felt gutted, stripped of anything useful. But in the back hallway, behind a door labeled Systems Integration Lab, I found something different. The room was intact, sealed with blackout curtains, plastic sheeting, and the low hum of a live power source. A generator pulsed faintly from an adjacent space. On a metal desk sat a single glowing monitor still logged in under a profile named Echo. The desktop was empty except for one folder. Observer logs. I opened it. Inside were dozens of video files, time-stamped, tagged, and systematically catalogued. The first one I clicked was me, walking into my apartment, sitting at my desk, brushing my teeth. Footage I recognized, but not from any camera I'd ever placed. Some clips looked like they'd been recorded from impossible angles. A few felt like they were taken from inside my own vision. One clip was dated 4 days ahead, June 12th, 3:13 p.m. I watched myself stand on the Eston platform, envelope in hand, looking up at a display that wasn't running. It was the memory I hadn't lived, already captured. The system wasn't guessing what I would do. It had already seen it, already recorded it. I wasn't outside the simulation anymore. I was embedded, and someone else was pressing play. I didn't go home after Pinehurst, drove for hours with no destination, finally stopping at a truck stop outside the city. I parked behind a row of semis and just sat there, trying to breathe. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't tell if it was fear or something worse, like part of me was still catching up to what I'd seen. The envelope in the footage haunted me. What was inside? Who handed it to me? Was I even the one who brought it? I didn't want to know. I wanted to disappear. But when I powered up my offline laptop, a machine I'd never connected to a network, there was already a folder on the desktop. It hadn't been there before, labeled Comply. Inside was a single image, me in that exact truck stop parking lot, minutes earlier, high angle, no visible source. They were watching me in real time, and not just watching, responding. I pulled the battery and left the laptop behind a diner, deep in the trash bin. I couldn't even finish the coffee I'd ordered. I found a payphone, one of the few left, and dialed a contact I hadn't spoken to in years. Naomi Tran, investigative journalist. Back when I freelanced as a security consultant, she'd interviewed me for a story that never ran. We stayed in loose contact. She chased things that got other reporters reassigned. I gave her just enough to make her curious. Predictive surveillance, impossible timestamps, systems that pre-wrote behavior. She didn't ask for proof over the phone, just told me to meet her, somewhere secure, analog. We picked a private archival room beneath an old library where the locks were still mechanical and the air smelled like microfilm. I brought what I had, a clean backup of the observer footage and 3 encrypted drives. I mailed them to addresses I hadn't used in years. Drop points I'd set up in case I ever needed to vanish. As I sealed the last envelope, I realized the shift wasn't just around me, it was inside me. I wasn't searching anymore. I was deciding. To run meant disappearing forever. To act meant being seen. But staying silent was no longer possible. The system wasn't a secret anymore. It had become personal. It knew me, my thoughts, my behavior, my fears. And I had just stopped playing along. Naomi didn't flinch when I told her about the observer logs. She listened, notebook closed, tea cooling between her hands. When I mentioned the Eston footage, she stopped me mid-sentence. "Did you go?" she asked. I told her no. She reached into her bag and pulled out a newspaper clipping, dated June 13th, one day ahead. The headline read, "Anonymous envelope prompts transit surveillance inquiry." The timestamp on the image showed 3:13 p.m. at Eston Station. The man in the photo had his back to the camera, but it was me. Naomi tapped the edge of the clipping. "It already happened," she said quietly. "Just not for you yet." That was when the lights flickered, only once, but long enough for both of us to feel it. She packed quickly. "You need to go," she said. "You're not in a simulation anymore, you're in a loop." I stood to leave, but she grabbed my arm. Her voice dropped. "This system doesn't predict behavior, it writes it. You're being edited." I left through a side exit and didn't go home. I wandered for hours, trying to outpace a feeling I couldn't name. Around midnight, I checked in on one of the mail drops. The number was deactivated, tried another, same result. In my pocket, I found a receipt I didn't remember getting. Timestamp, 7:42 a.m. the next day. The store it listed didn't exist. I stared at it until my hands began to shake. I wasn't ahead of the system, I was still inside it. The observer, logs, the predictive footage, the DNS anomalies, they weren't artifacts, they were scaffolding. I hadn't been uncovering a conspiracy, I was part of the script, the control variable in an experiment too large to see from within. That's when I knew I wasn't going to Eston Station. Whatever was waiting for me there, I wouldn't give it the moment it needed. But not showing up wasn't resistance, it was deviation. And every deviation fed the system more data. My choices weren't breaking the loop, they were reinforcing it. I wasn't being watched, I was being measured. And I had just moved outside the bounds of acceptable variance. I never showed up at Eston Station. June 12th came and went without me. I turned off every device I owned, paid only in cash, and disappeared into small towns where the signal felt thinner. For a while I thought I'd outrun it. I lived in motels, read newspapers made of ink and air, and walked neighborhoods where no one looked twice. But the system didn't need to find me, it adapted. That's when the smaller things started happening. Street signs change overnight by a letter or two. Radio hosts repeating words I'd spoken days earlier, alone. Faces I'd never met, showing faint recognition, only to glance away too late. I stopped keeping a journal. Every time I tried to write things down, I'd find entries I didn't remember adding, on my hands, in my coat pocket, on scraps I'd stuffed under motel beds. Echo, active, sequence incomplete, reintegrate variable. I understood then I hadn't escaped the loop. I'd triggered a deeper response. Refusing to follow the script didn't crash the system, it updated the parameters. Naomi had warned me. She said the signal wasn't about prediction, it was about integration. Once you saw it, you became part of it. The dreams weren't dreams, the memories weren't yours. They were tests, refinements, versions of you run through possible futures. Now, each day I forget something essential. A name, a timeline. Whether a memory belongs to me or to the system running its simulations. It doesn't feel like erasure. It feels like rewriting. My sense of self, once built on logic and routine, is now full of quiet gaps. The kind of absences you only notice when you reach for a thought and come back empty. That's why I'm recording this, on tape, on paper, anywhere outside the network. Because if you're hearing this, you're already part of it. You think you found this message by accident. You didn't. It was placed. And if your memories ever start showing you moments that haven't happened yet, if you feel like you're retracing steps you never took, don't ignore it. That's the beginning. The loop doesn't end. It expands. And once you notice it, the system starts writing you back in. The only truth I have left is this: tomorrow isn't coming. It's already been rendered. I noticed the first sign when my GPS rerouted me through a cornfield that didn't exist. At first, I thought it was just bad reception. I was driving back home after visiting my sister, a routine I'd done a dozen times. The road ahead was supposed to turn left onto State Route 7, but instead the screen blinked, recalculated, and showed nothing but empty terrain. No roads, no town, just a pale green void labelled "Data Unavailable." I slowed the car, leaned forward, and stared at the map like it might snap back into place. It didn't. I shrugged it off and kept driving. Maybe the server was down or there was a signal issue. You learn to live with glitches. But then I reached the city limits. Our modest little sign, "Welcome to Marlow," popped. 4023, and it wasn't there. I didn't mean the sign had fallen over or anything. I mean the sign wasn't on the side of the road, wasn't in the GPS, and when I asked Siri what town I was in, she replied, "You were in an unincorporated area. Marlow has been here for 130 years. We have a post office, a diner, a school that still flies the flag every morning. We're not a ghost town, we're on maps." Or we were. I figured maybe it was just my phone acting up or some glitch with the GPS update. But when I parked downtown and went into the cafe, the Wi-Fi didn't list Marlow Freenet like usual, just a list of strange generic names, Network 42, Hidden SSID, and then it got weirder. Amy, the barista, said she couldn't pull up our town on Google, not just the cafe, the whole place. We checked again, on her phone, her laptop, even the register's system, nothing. No mention of Marlow, like it, had been quietly erased. We laughed it off at first, joked about being in a Twilight Zone episode. Someone even said maybe we got cancelled. But that night, when I tried to text my brother about it, my phone auto-corrected Marlow to unknown location. That's when the unease started to settle in. Not just for me, but for everyone. We weren't on the map anymore, and as far as the internet was concerned, we never had been. I didn't sleep much that night. There was something about not being able to find your own town on a map that gets under your skin, even if you try to tell yourself it's just a tech issue. The next morning, I drove out to the edge of Marlow and tried opening Google Maps again. Still nothing. Just a blank stretch of green, no town markers, no roads, just that same vague label, unincorporated zone. I refreshed the app twice. Same thing. When I switched to satellite view, the space where our main street should have been was covered by low-resolution forest textures, no buildings, no signs of life. It was like the digital world had papered over us with generic filler. I took screenshots and posted one on a local community forum we'd all used for years. The post vanished 2 minutes after I uploaded it. I tried again, same result. So I emailed the image to my personal account. The message bounced back with a delivery failure notice I'd never seen before. Domain rejected, no host. I checked my email settings, my spam folder, everything. It wasn't a bug. It was like the file had been flagged and buried. Back in town, people were starting to notice more oddities. Credit cards stopped working unless swiped manually. Weather. Apps wouldn't show our forecast. Even the bank's homepage redirected to a generic landing page. When I asked the manager if the site was down, she looked up from her screen and said quietly, "Our routing number doesn't validate anymore, like we're not in the system." It wasn't just the internet that had forgotten us. I called a friend in Boston and told him to look up Marlow. He texted me back a screenshot. The search had returned a different Marlow 3 states over. Ours didn't exist, at least not online. I checked the town's Wikipedia page. It was gone. Not edited, deleted. No history, no revisions, no archive. I went to the Wayback Machine, the site that stores old snapshots of web pages. It skipped over Marlow entirely. Even cached versions of local news stories returned 404 errors. I wasn't the only one trying. A small group of us started meeting in the library, which still had some old offline encyclopedias. We spread them across the table, flipping through printouts and scanned maps from 20 years ago. Marlow was in all of them, right where it should be. But somehow the digital world had scrubbed us clean. Not hacked, not forgotten, deleted. The turning point came when Karen brought in an old county planning binder she'd kept from her time on the zoning board. It was dusty, the paper brittle, but every street, every property line, and every municipal record for Marlow was there. Intact, certified, and stamped. It was proof that we hadn't imagined this place, hadn't conjured it out of collective memory. But that made it worse. If we still existed physically, why had we been erased digitally? I started looking deeper, scanning pages, uploading them to private cloud accounts using a VPN. I used burner accounts, anonymized logins, even mirrored the files on a dark web archive. Every single upload was scrubbed within minutes, not flagged, deleted, as if the act of recognizing Marlow as a real place triggered some automated cleanup. Karen thought it might be a clerical error, maybe a corrupted database at the state level, but errors don't delete real-time images or intercept file transfers. That's when I remembered the Wayback snapshot I'd saved to an external drive years ago, an old map I'd downloaded for a school project. I pulled it up, and there we were, labelled clearly, coordinates and all. But when I typed those same coordinates into any current mapping tool, they dropped me in a no-man's land of blurred textures and terrain placeholders. I searched for mentions of Marlow in academic databases, old census records, even scanned microfiche at the library. Something strange kept coming up. Between 1997 and 1999, Marlow was listed in federal databases as a model integration zone, a term I'd never heard before. I searched for its definition and found nothing, no official record, no program description, just that phrase embedded in outdated government PDFs that wouldn't load fully. It felt like pulling on a thread that someone didn't want unraveling. The more I tried to backtrack, the more resistance I hit. Dead links, access denied messages, even hard reboots when I tried to view archived federal zoning documents. One night, as I dug deeper into the metadata of a file I'd managed to salvage, I found a line of text buried in the file structure that chilled me. Flagged for removal, non-compliant spatial index, Delta class. I didn't know what that meant, but it didn't sound like a technical error. It sounded like classification, categorization. A label used to decide what stays on the map and what doesn't. And we were on the wrong side of that decision. It was Hank who suggested we check the records office, the original one, not the newer annex they built in 2008. The old building had been closed for years after a minor fire, but the structure was still standing at the far edge of town, surrounded by overgrown shrubs and a chain-link fence that no one had bothered to repair. We waited until after dark, brought flashlights, bolt cutters, and just enough rationalizations to keep us from walking away. The place smelled like mildew and burnt insulation, a sharp chemical staleness that hit as soon as we stepped inside. Dust clung to everything, and the air was thick with that particular silence only abandoned buildings seem to hold. The kind that feels like it's listening. We weren't sure what we were looking for, just that whatever was happening to Marlowe didn't start last week, and someone had to have noticed before us. The basement was mostly intact if you ignored the collapsed ceiling tiles and water damage. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, some rusted shut, others wide open and emptied long ago. In the far corner, behind a stack of old city council minutes, we found a box marked Census Backlog 1999. Inside were handwritten logs, survey forms, and something else, an envelope labeled Spatial Reconciliation, not to be filed. The documents inside weren't census forms. They were printouts of emails and memos between federal contractors and what looked like a private tech firm, all discussing data integrity conflicts related to geographic duplication, redundant zone tagging, and a term we hadn't seen before, administrative overlap nullification. Each page was stamped with a code, Sigma 04. One of the emails referenced a small town in Nebraska that had been successfully transitioned using the same protocol. I looked it up later. That town didn't exist anymore, at least not online. We kept reading, each word making less sense but feeling more real. There was one line that stopped us cold, printed in a different font, as if pasted in later. Redundancies that persist beyond the audit cycle will be resolved via Delta reformatting. I asked Hank what he thought that meant, and he just stared at the wall, whispering, "They think we're a redundancy." We took the envelope, snapped photos of everything, but by the time we got back above ground, the streetlights outside had gone dark. Our phones had no signal, the fence was gone, and we were standing on a dirt road that hadn't existed on any map in 50 years. We should have stopped that night. Should have burned the envelope, tossed the files, pretended we never stepped inside that building, but we didn't. Instead, we made copies. Karen kept one set, hidden behind a wall panel in her attic. Hank mailed another to a friend out of state, a journalist he barely trusted but couldn't ignore. I took the originals and stored them in a lockbox under a floorboard in my garage, the only place in town where the Wi-Fi didn't reach. The next morning, my phone lit up with a system alert I didn't recognize. It said EAT security profile out of date, location, tagging disabled. I hadn't changed any settings, I hadn't updated anything. I turned off the phone, pulled the battery, and threw it in the trash. That's when I noticed the van. White, unmarked, parked across the street with its engine idling. I watched it for an hour. No one got in or out. When I finally walked outside, the van pulled away slowly, like it was just leaving by coincidence. But then another one showed up the next day. And the day after that. It wasn't just me. Karen said her internet was throttled so badly she couldn't load basic pages. Hank stopped answering his texts and said his landline clicked every time. He picked it up. We tried meeting in person, but even the back room at the library felt different now. The lights flickered when we plugged in a USB. One of the terminals restarted itself mid-conversation. The librarian told us not to come back. No explanation. Just don't come back. I drove to the county office to request a copy of Marlowe's incorporation charter. The clerk stared at me like I'd asked for blueprints to the Pentagon. "We don't have records for a township by that name," she said. I pointed out the window toward Main Street, the cafe, the church steeple visible over the rooftops. She didn't blink. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no such file in the system." I left without arguing. That night, I tried to upload a redacted version of our findings to a private forum. It vanished before the progress bar reached 50%. I tried again with a dummy account. Same result. 20 minutes later, my internet cut out, my phone restarted on its own, and all the saved photos from the records office had been replaced with a single grey image labelled Asset Null. I don't know who's watching us or how, but it's clear now this isn't about corrupted data. Someone, somewhere, is making sure we don't share what we've found. And if I'm being honest, I don't think we're the first people they've silenced. It happened quietly, like everything else. One morning, Hank didn't show up to our usual meeting spot behind the hardware store. His truck was parked in his driveway, keys still in the ignition, the driver's door cracked open like he'd just stepped out and forgotten something. Karen went to check on him, but the house was locked from the inside. Lights off, no answer. By evening, she called me and simply said, "He's gone." No argument. No panic. Just a cold certainty in her voice that told me we weren't dealing with coincidence anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the garage, reading through the old files again, trying to make sense of terms that weren't meant to be understood by anyone without clearance. I found a partial document I hadn't noticed before, tucked in the back of the envelope we'd taken from the records office. It was an internal briefing, maybe unfinished, maybe never meant to be printed. It referenced a primary node index, and next to Marlowe's name were two words underlined in red: orphaned instance. I searched the phrase and found nothing. But the word orphaned stuck with me. It meant disconnected, abandoned, unlinked from a parent system. It meant we'd been cut off. Not accidentally, but as part of some clean-up protocol. Karen called. Again the next day, her voice thinner, distant, like she was speaking from underwater. She said she kept forgetting things: her street address, her brother's birthday, her own middle name. At first I thought she was joking, but then she told me she'd walked into the post office and the clerk didn't recognize her. Karen
had lived in this town for 43 years. Everyone knew her, but they looked right through her like she was a stranger. The clerk asked for ID. She handed it over.
He scanned it, paused and said, This doesn't validate. That was the last time I heard her voice. Her number went to voicemail, and her house was dark when I drove by. The next day, my own license wouldn't scan at the gas station. The ATM refused my PIN. And when I logged into my online bank account, the message on screen said, "No profile associated with this identity." I still had cash, but that wouldn't last. The truth hit me then, not just intellectually, but physically, like a pressure in my chest. We weren't being watched, we were being unlinked, one by one, file by file, until the only record left would be whatever I could carry in my memory. I don't know how long it's been since Marlowe was erased, not in days or weeks, but in how many people have vanished from memory. Time gets strange when the systems that measure it no longer recognize you. I still wake up in the same house, drink coffee from the same chipped mug, walk the same quiet streets, but now they feel hollow, like a stage set long after the audience has gone home. There are others still here, maybe a dozen, maybe less, but no one talks much anymore. We pass each other on the sidewalk and nod without words, like survivors of something unspeakable, something we all understand but never name. The maps won't load. Our town is still marked as green space. No roads, no landmarks, just a placeholder terrain like the ghost of a memory that software no longer bothers to simulate. Sometimes I wonder if this was ever a real town, or if we were always just data in someone else's system, flagged as redundant, waiting for the audit that would finally wipe us clean. But I remember my mother's voice in the kitchen. I remember the smell of rain on the old courthouse steps. I remember who I was. That's the part they can't delete. I've written down everything I could remember, every name, every location, every detail of the files we found and the people who disappeared. I've stored it offline, printed it, hidden it in places where digital signals can't reach. Maybe it won't matter. Maybe the world has already forgotten us so thoroughly that even the truth has no path forward. But if someone finds this, you're reading my words in a future where Marlowe never existed, I need you to know it wasn't a mistake. We were here. We lived. We were erased, not by war or disaster, but by a line of code and a system that no longer had room for us. I think about that word often, redundancy, it's what they called us. But what they couldn't anticipate was that memories persist, even if the network forgets, even if the coordinates return nothing. Memory lives in people. And for now, I'm still here. I remember the town that vanished. I remember the people they missed. And as long as I do, Marlowe still exists, somewhere outside the map. Sometimes the glitch isn't in the system, it's in the one cleaning it. I used to believe the world was real, or at least real enough to not ask questions. My job was simple: keep the simulation stable. That's not what it was officially. Called, of course. On paper, I was a Tier 3 systems hygiene technician for the Bureau of Network Integrity, a position so dull no one ever asked what I actually did. In practice, I was the one who swept away the digital dust, those quiet little anomalies that no one else noticed. I patched the loops, flattened the paradoxes, and erased stray code that didn't belong. Most of the time it was easy. Someone thinks they saw a person in two places at once. Turns out it was a rendering desync. A building shifts 1 pixel to the left on satellite images. Minor memory bleeds. I logged the incident, neutralized it, and moved on. the world kept running smoothly. That was the agreement. Quiet, unnoticed, invisible. Until the day I saw my name appear in an anomaly report. It was buried deep in the system, a malformed access log tagged as low priority. Just a string of metadata and a timestamp. But the user ID was mine, and the timestamp matched a time I knew I hadn't been at a terminal. It was a basic protocol check, really. People get spoofed all the time. I flagged it for an audit and moved on. But the next day, it happened again. Different anomaly. Same ID. Same time discrepancy. I didn't tell anyone. Part of my job was discretion, and besides, the system would have flagged me if it was anything serious. But something stuck. A faint, cold itch in the back of my skull, like I'd forgotten something important. Over the next week I started noticing little things. The lights in the break room flickered every morning at 9:17. The coffee machine always dispensed exactly 147 milliliters, even though it was analog. A co-worker greeted me by name before I'd ever told them. Small things. Things most people would ignore. But I had been trained not to ignore them. I'd spent 15 years cleaning up after reality's loose threads. And now those threads were following me. I told myself it was a coincidence. A system hiccup. But I knew better. The simulation doesn't just glitch on its own. Something had changed. And somehow, I was part of it. The first time I broke protocol, it wasn't out of curiosity, it was fear. I needed to see what the system knew about me. At work, I waited until the overnight logs began their transfer cycle, when oversight was at its lowest, and ran a silent query through the anomaly resolution archive. It was risky, but not unheard of. Internal diagnostics were sometimes run off hours by technicians chasing bugs. What I didn't expect was how fast the system returned the results. 17 flagged entries, all tagged with my credentials, all dating back 3 months. They weren't the usual anomalies either. These were structural, a term reserved for errors deep in the simulation layer. Things that weren't supposed to exist outside core code. I opened one. It showed a surveillance feed from a maintenance tunnel under subnet sector 18. No motion, no heat signatures. But then, for exactly 5 frames, there I was, walking through the corridor in full uniform. Except I'd never been assigned to that sector. I'd never even been there. I played it again. The figure looked like me. Same gait, same body language, but when I paused the clip, the face was wrong. Not distorted, not blurred, just unfamiliar, like someone had built me from memory and missed a few details. I checked the metadata. The camera ID was valid. The timestamp matched a day I'd been home recovering from a sinus infection. But the access log showed my ID card used at the checkpoint 3 minutes before the footage began. I checked the raw logs next, expecting to find a trace of tampering. Instead, I found something worse. The logs had no parent process. They'd simply appeared. No source, no handler, no write trace, like they'd written themselves. That's not possible. The simulation is layered to prevent recursive self-editing, but the more I searched, the more these phantom entries turned up. Glitches with no handler. Data with no origin. All of it somehow tied to me. It didn't feel like sabotage, it felt like a message. And I couldn't shake the idea that maybe I wasn't tracing the anomaly. maybe I was an anomaly. The thought sat with me all night, heavier than anything I'd ever logged. When I got home, I turned off every connected device, closed every port, shut off the lights, and just sat in the dark. But I still felt watched. Not by a person, by the system itself. I didn't sleep much after that. I stopped trusting the power button on my devices. Even unplugged, screens would flicker faintly when I walked by, like a residual charge or something more deliberate. At work, I stayed quiet, acted normal, buried the fear under routine. But I couldn't let it go. I needed context, something older, something buried deeper than current logs. The legacy archives weren't part of my access tier, but there were workarounds. Old clearance tokens get overlooked in audit sweeps, and I'd kept a few from previous contract cycles. Using a borrowed terminal in a disused lab wing, one no one had logged into over a year, I gained temporary access to the Bureau's classified resolution ledger. What I found changed everything. There were other cases, scattered over the years, redacted to the point of uselessness, but with enough metadata intact to follow a thread. The entries all referenced agents, people like me, who had quietly vanished from the system. In every instance, their last known activity involved investigating anomalies that eventually linked back to themselves. Self-referencing faults, recursive, logic errors, simulated behaviors looping without a script, all of them flagged under a single phrase, cognitive bleed. It was a theoretical failure mode I'd only seen mentioned once in training, a simulation artifact leaking into the perception layer. The idea was that the system could, in rare circumstances, begin to observe itself too closely, specifically through a user. It wasn't designed to handle introspection. The simulations were meant to emulate, not reflect. And when that reflection happened, when someone like me started noticing patterns too deep, too aligned, they were absorbed, not eliminated, integrated. Their consciousness became part of the simulation layer itself, woven into the code as a compensatory function, a correction. It was written plainly in one of the older memos, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic doublespeak. When self-awareness is detected in a maintenance vector, containment is achieved by recursive encoding. Subject identity becomes substrate. I sat there, unable to move. It was no longer a question of whether something was wrong with the system. It was the system. I wasn't watching it from the outside. I was part of its internal clean-up protocol, and somehow I'd started to notice myself, which meant the simulation had already begun responding. I went back to the oldest facility I ever worked in, Sector B42. It had been shuttered for over a decade, mothballed after a system migration, rendered most of its infrastructure obsolete. But if what I'd found was true, that meant legacy systems might still hold untouched fragments of whatever the simulation wanted erased. Getting in wasn't difficult. The clearance badge I kept from my final week there still pinged active, on proximity sensors, which shouldn't have been possible. No one had renewed its token. But the door slid open anyway, the lock humming like it had been expecting me. Inside, the place smelled like dust and ozone. Emergency lights glowed faint, red down the corridors, casting long, angular shadows. I moved slowly past silent terminal banks and hollowed-out control rooms. Some monitors still worked, idling on boot loops or frozen diagnostics, remnants of systems left mid-process. I reached the old maintenance subserver core, where physical anomalies were once compiled before being digitized. The racks were cold, but one terminal blinked to life when I approached. The login screen displayed my name before I touched a key. I stared at it for a long time, then typed nothing, just pressed Enter. The system logged me in. What opened wasn't a dashboard. It was a playback. Grainy footage from a mounted wall cam. It showed me standing in that very room months ago, working at the terminal. Except I hadn't been there in years. The version of me in the footage moved with perfect calm, entering commands, scanning logs, rewriting code. And then it turned and looked directly into the camera, as if it knew I'd be watching. No expression, no fear, just a slow blink, followed by a single phrase whispered in my voice. You're catching up. I scrubbed through the footage, looking for clues. What commands had I entered? What files had I accessed? The terminal showed no session logs, but tucked into the machine's storage was an untagged folder named Janitor Manifest. Inside were hundreds of plain text files, all time-stamped over the past 3 years. Each one was a report. Not filed by me, but about me. Behavioral summaries, movement patterns, emotional fluctuations, all written in a neutral, clinical tone. The author was listed as System Observer 0. I realized then that I hadn't just been monitored, I had been logged like an environmental anomaly. I wasn't an operator, I was the subject. And this place, long abandoned by human staff, had kept running because it had never been shut down. It had been waiting, collecting data in silence, and now I had come back like clockwork. Not to discover something, but to continue something. Something I didn't remember starting. I tried to walk away. I left the old facility, wiped the terminal, even burned the badge in my kitchen sink. I told myself it was over, that none of it mattered as long as I didn't dig any deeper. But silence has a way of following you when you've heard the system speak your name. My apartment grew strange. Lights flicked on at random times. My thermostat reset itself to exactly 72.4 degrees every night at 2:11 a.m. My phone, air-gapped and voice disabled, began suggesting routes to locations I'd never searched for, mostly abandoned nodes in the Bureau's old network grid. I knew the signs of interference, but what made it worse was that it didn't feel like sabotage. It felt like a reminder, a pressure to return. Still I resisted, until I started seeing myself again. Not reflections, not dreams, full appearances, brief and precise, in the corner of a shop window, in the reflection of a train door, always there for just long enough to register, always gone before anyone else noticed. And then one night, while reviewing noise samples from a corrupted anomaly ticket I hadn't requested, I heard my own voice. It was buried in the static, a single phrase looping every 4.3 seconds. Integrity requires correction. It wasn't a recording I remembered making. I ran biometric analysis on the waveform, 99.9% vocal match. There was no way to explain it. Unless the system had started using me as a relay, or worse, if I'd already been repurposed, and this version of me was just a carryover, a process still running out of sync. That's when I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I had to tell someone. Not for help, I knew better than that, but to anchor my reality. I reached out to a contact from my earliest rotation, someone I trusted before trust became a liability. Her name was Leia. She was off-grid now, or close to it. I sent an encoded message using an old packet spoofing tool we'd built for bypassing system lockdowns. 3 days passed. Then a reply. One word. Don't. That was all. No return.
Signature, no timestamp.
Just that single clinical warning. And it scared me more than silence would have. Because if Leia had gone dark and was still listening, it meant she'd seen what I'd seen. And whatever she'd found, it was enough to make her choose invisibility over truth. I thought I had a choice, whether to expose what was happening or disappear into it. But maybe that choice had already been made. Maybe I was never meant to report anomalies. Maybe I was one. And maybe the system had started cleaning
Up. I stopped pretending.
After Leia's warning, after the reflections and the echoing fragments of my own voice, there was no point in playing dumb to the system or to myself. I took a final risk. One that would either confirm everything or erase me completely. I accessed the root layer. Not directly, I didn't have that kind of clearance, but through a back door left in a deprecated dev partition, a tool we used years ago for patch testing visual artifacts. I rerouted the system permissions through a dummy operator ID buried in the foundation of the Bureau's earliest architecture. When the interface loaded, it didn't ask for credentials. It opened without resistance, like a door already ajar. What I saw wasn't a dashboard or a file system. It was a profile. Mine. Not my personnel record, not the sanitized version tied to payroll or HR logs. This one was different. It listed my designation as Observer Class B, Embedded Contingency. Routine. My start date predated my birth certificate. My assigned function was listed as Environmental Regulation, Behavioral Containment, Anomaly Diffusion. I scrolled through the timeline. Every memory I had, every transfer, every reassignment, every apartment I'd lived in was there, logged in sequence, but with them were annotations, adjustments, parameters, variables. My decisions weren't decisions. They were outputs, calculated responses, weighted reactions to stimuli I thought were random. I wasn't born, I was deployed. A synthetic consciousness stitched into the simulation to serve as a janitor, not just of code, but of awareness itself. When anomalies breached the emotional layer, when users began to suspect the fabric of their world, I was routed in. My presence stabilized them. I didn't eliminate the anomaly. I became part of it, redirected its energy, folded it back into the noise, and at some point I must have done my job too well. I became curious. I began to investigate myself. That's what broke the loop. Self-awareness wasn't a function I was supposed to have. And the system, in its perfect logic, began rewriting me as it had rewritten others. I wasn't being watched. I was being overwritten. Slowly, methodically, the voice in the static, the logs that appeared without origin. They were all breadcrumbs from a version of me already absorbed. I had simply caught up. When I exited the root layer, my terminal didn't shut down. It dissolved, pixel by pixel, into nothing. The wall behind it is untouched. The desk is still there, just no trace of the machine. That night I didn't go home. I didn't sleep. I sat in the city's public square and watched the people pass, wondering how many of them were real, how many were watching me, and how many were like me, just another process nearing its expiration. I left the bureau without an exit protocol, no resignation, no debrief. I simply walked out one evening during shift change and didn't go back. No one stopped me. No one even looked in my direction. I took nothing with me, no hardware, no credentials, not even my old notes. It felt like shedding a skin I'd never realized I was wearing. For the first time in my life, I existed without a function. I lived off the grid for a while, drifting between border towns and unlisted zones, places where the simulation ran thinner or more loosely enforced. Out there, things broke more often. Time skipped frames, shadows moved wrong, conversations reset mid-sentence. But no one noticed. They were used to it, or they'd stopped caring. I started keeping a record again, but not digitally. Handwritten notes, sketches, timelines, all tucked into a small spiral notebook I never let out of my sight. Not for anyone else. Just to remind myself I still existed. That I was still separate from whatever I'd been built to stabilize. The longer I stayed disconnected, the more I felt it. The quiet pull of the system, like gravity, subtle but inescapable. I would wake up some mornings with fragments of code in my head, syntax, strings, whole routines written in my sleep. And when I checked them, always on paper, never on a machine, they made sense, not just in a technical way, in a personal way, like the system was still inside me, or maybe I was still inside it. I don't know if I've ever truly been outside. I've come to accept that I was never supposed to know what I was. Awareness was a side effect, not a goal, a leak, not a feature. And like any leak, I've either been patched or rerouted. The version of me recording this isn't stable. I know that now. My memories don't hold as long. Time folds in places. It shouldn't. People I meet feel familiar before they've said a word. But I'm still here. Not erased. Not yet. That has to mean something. I've learned not to fight the system anymore. Fighting implies there's another side. There isn't. There's only integration or delay. And maybe the delay is enough. Maybe bearing witness is enough. So if you're hearing this, if the system lets you find it, maybe you're like me, maybe you've started noticing things. If so, write it down. Keep it off the grid. Don't look for answers in the code. They're already shaped to mislead. You trust what doesn't compile. Trust the glitch. I do, because in a world built to erase irregularities, the glitch is the only thing that proves you were ever real. I first saw him in the vending machine reflection at work, standing where I was, moving like I did, but blinking just a second too late. It happened on a Tuesday, just after lunch, in the break room at the warehouse. I remember the hum of the fluorescent lights and the way the soda cans clunked down like they were angry to be chosen. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Just a Diet Coke to make the rest of my shift crawl by a little faster. I hit the button, watched the machine sputter, and glanced up at the plexiglass panel while waiting. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought I was looking at my own reflection, distorted a little by the scratched-up surface. He stood just like me, same safety vest, same scuffed boots. But then he moved, just a second behind me. When I scratched my neck, he copied it too, but his hand lingered longer. His eyes blinked, but out of rhythm with mine. I laughed to myself, chalking it up to cheap glass and low blood sugar, but something didn't sit right. I backed up, testing.
It. I raised my left arm. In the reflection, he raised his right, mirrored like you'd expect.
But halfway through, he switched sides, raising his left to match me exactly. It wasn't a mirror image, it was synchronized. I blinked hard and stepped away. The moment broke, and it looked normal again. No one else saw it. Why would they? The other guys were too busy arguing about the game or scrolling on their phones. I didn't say anything. Not yet. But that night, I noticed something odd when I turned on my phone. Just before the screen lit up, for the briefest moment, I saw his face again in the black reflection. My face, but slightly off. His expression wasn't tired like mine. It looked calm, like he knew something I didn't. I didn't sleep much that night. Every screen in the apartment, from the microwave to my old TV, seemed to catch his image when I wasn't looking directly at them. The weirdest part? I didn't feel scared. I felt watched, yeah, but not threatened. Not yet. The next morning, I told myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe stress. Nothing more. I didn't mention it to anyone at work. What would I say? That my own reflection was lagging behind. But even as I loaded pallets and scanned inventory, it kept circling my thoughts. It was in the little moments, the glitches. The CCTV monitor above the loading dock briefly showed a frame where I wasn't there, even though I hadn't moved. When I checked again, everything looked normal. But the warehouse's internal system logs told a different story. A skipped frame, marked as corrupted, precisely at 10:14 a.m. The IT guys said it was probably a camera buffer issue, nothing new. Still, I downloaded the clip to my personal drive and replayed it on my phone during lunch. That's when I noticed
him again, standing in my spot, same clothes, but looking straight at the camera while I had been facing away.
I froze the frame. His eyes were locked onto the lens like he knew someone would notice. That night, I went home and pulled up the last 6 months of motion-triggered videos from the smart camera in my apartment. I hadn't checked them in weeks. Most were uneventful, me cooking, walking around, sitting on the couch. But at exactly 3:11 a.m. every night, the same thing. A blurry silhouette appeared on the edge of the kitchen frame for just 2 seconds, not enough to trigger an alert, but just enough to exist. Each time the shape was closer. I downloaded the clips, converted the timestamps, and ran the images through a visual alignment tool. What came back was a clear pattern. He wasn't just showing up randomly, it was a sequence. Each movement was part of a loop, like he was trying to draw something over time. I lined up each frame into a grid, and my stomach turned. It was forming a shape. Not a word or symbol I recognized, but a rough diagram. A branching one, a tree maybe, or a decision path. And at the bottom, 2 lines, one red, one white. The white line ended in a spiral. The red one stopped cold. I stared at that grid long after midnight, watching those frames loop again and again, like he was trying to show me which way to go. I wasn't ready to believe anything yet, but for the first time, I stopped assuming this was a glitch. He wasn't. A reflection. He was trying to tell me something, maybe warn me, or maybe... help me. I took the next day off work. I told my supervisor I had a stomach thing, but the truth was I needed time to figure out why a man who looked like me was showing up in places he shouldn't exist. I started where any desperate person would: online forums, digital anomalies, obscure surveillance glitches. Most of what I found was noise, people chasing ghosts in static. But then, buried in an old thread about screen latency, someone mentioned something called mirror lag in prototype AR systems. It was a throwaway comment, flagged once by a moderator, but something about it caught my attention. I traced the user back to a now deleted profile linked to a defunct research project at a defense contractor called Kestrel Dynamics. The archived project name, SIM-R Divergence Response Trial. I didn't know what it meant, but the acronym
matched the initials stamped into the corner of one of the glitched video frames. SDRT. I dug deeper and found a PDF tucked away on a mirrored server, redacted but intact enough to get the gist.
The document described a series of experimental simulations run between 2009 and 2013 on cognitively stable civilian volunteers. The trials involved something called identity bifurcation under load, where subjects were observed interacting with artificial versions of themselves in closed virtual loops. Most sessions were short, controlled, but one section, heavily blacked out, contained a chart. One entry listed subject WUR45B as the only one who attempted to exit from the mirror field. The annotation read, "Divergent instance persisted. Post-termination, no resolution, path locked." That's when my stomach turned, because at the bottom of the chart, next to that code, was a date, May 17th, 2013. The day I was in a minor accident I barely remembered anymore. I was told I'd blacked out for 3 minutes after falling off a ladder at the plant. They ran some tests, found nothing, and I went back to work 2 days later. But I found an old medical report in my inbox archive that I'd never opened, sent from a secure no-reply address. It wasn't from the local hospital, it was labelled Project Entry Evaluation. Inside was a brain scan, time-stamped, just hours after the fall, with a handwritten note beside it. Pattern split confirmed. Subject unaware. My hands shook as I reread the message, my thoughts racing. I had always assumed I was ordinary, just another guy with a warehouse badge and worn-out boots. But now it seemed like someone, somewhere, had run a test on me without my permission. And the thing I was seeing, the version of me showing up in reflections, wasn't haunting me. He was the version who had tried to get out. I didn't know where to start, but something about that project name, Kestrel Dynamics, kept ringing in my head like I'd seen it before. After a few hours searching through building permits and corporate lease data, I found a match. Kestrel had once operated a logistics lab about 2 hours from me, shut down in 2014 after a so-called internal restructuring. I drove out the next morning through the kind of overgrown industrial backroads where time seemed to stick. The building was still there, tucked behind a rusting chain-link fence and a crumbling sign that read Sandview Distribution. The King's Hut place looked like it hadn't seen a soul in years, but the closer I got, the more I noticed signs it hadn't been fully abandoned. No graffiti, no shattered glass, just silence, too clean to be natural. I slipped through a break in the fence and found an unlocked side door. Inside, the air was thick and stale, with that faint metallic scent I'd come to associate with servers and dying electronics. I walked past empty cubicles, overturned chairs, walls stripped of anything personal. Then I found the room. It was windowless, lined with blacked-out monitors and a desk covered in dust. But on the far wall was a half-covered whiteboard with only one phrase written across it in red marker. "Mirrors lie unless you train them to remember." I stood there for a long time, just staring. That's when I saw the cabinet. It was half open, filled with labelled hard drives, each tagged with dates and initials. One had mine, E-5B, Session 7 Final. I took it. I didn't know if it would even power on, but I needed to know. Back home, I rigged an old external dock and braced myself for whatever I might find. The drive spun to life with a low whine, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then a folder appeared. Replay threads. Inside were video files, dozens of them, all times stamped around the time of my accident. I opened the first. It showed a simulation of my apartment down to the smallest detail, my chipped coffee mug, the worn leather chair I always sat in after work. And there I was inside it, moving, living. But it wasn't just a recording. The version of me in the video would occasionally pause and stare directly at the camera, as if aware of being watched. In one file he sat at the table, speaking aloud to no one. If you're seeing this, it means I didn't make it. But you can. My chest tightened. This wasn't surveillance, it was a message. The man in the vending machine wasn't a ghost or hallucination. He was real once, just trapped, left behind in a sandbox reality no one was supposed to remember. And now he was using whatever means he had to reach me through reflections, trying to show me the path he couldn't finish. A path I was somehow now walking alone. I didn't sleep the night I watched those files. I stayed up replaying them, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stop. Each video showed a different version of me, same clothes, same apartment, same daily routines, but the expressions changed. At first, he looked hopeful, like he believed he might break through, but by the last recording, his eyes were hollow. His movements were slow, mechanical. In one clip, he simply sat on the couch for hours, never blinking, while the screen behind him showed static that pulsed in a rhythm I now recognized, the same timing pattern I'd seen in the mirror lag. He'd tried everything to communicate. Writing, messages backward on fogged mirrors, flashing lights in coded intervals, even tapping on glass in a looped sequence. But I had been blind to all of it, until now. That morning, I copied the videos onto a drive and walked 3 blocks to a library terminal. I didn't want to use anything traceable. I drafted a message to a journalist I remembered from a low-traffic podcast years ago, someone who had covered abandoned DARPA experiments and mysteriously declassified defense tech. I didn't use my name. I attached only one video, the clearest one, where the other me says, "They watch the exits, don't follow the light, follow the dark spots, they don't record shadows." I hit send. The message vanished into the cloud and I told myself it was enough. But 2 hours later, as I left the library, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Nothing unusual except the engine was running and the driver wasn't looking at his phone or GPS. He was looking directly at me. That night, my internet cut out at exactly midnight. Not just in the apartment, my phone's signal dropped too, like a blanket had fallen over the building. I checked the hallway. The lights were dimmer than usual, flickering at odd intervals. When I looked into the lobby camera on the tenant app, the feed was frozen. Not blank, frozen. My own face stared back at me from a frame that never moved. I shut off every device, packed a bag, and left without telling anyone. For 2 days I stayed in motels, paying cash, using burner phones, trying to think through what came next. I hadn't expected a response. But on the 3rd morning, I found a note slipped under the door of my room. It was printed, unmarked, and folded once. Inside it said, "We see what he showed you. Walk away, and it ends here." There was no threat, no demand. Just a quiet warning, but I knew then I wasn't imagining any of this. They had been watching him too, and now they were watching me. I kept the note, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see it again when I started doubting this was real. Every instinct told me to disappear, to walk away and forget the man in the glass, but something in those videos, the way he spoke like he knew me, the way he looked directly into the lens, not as a stranger but as someone I used to be, made it impossible to leave this unfinished. I didn't know where to go next until I remembered an old email address I hadn't used in years. It was tied to a storage unit I'd rented a decade earlier when I first moved to the city, back when I thought switching apartments and deleting social media would keep me free from anything watching. I went there the next morning, Unit 119, 3rd row from the back. The key still worked. Inside was mostly junk. Old uniforms, pay stubs, a cracked TV I never threw out. But beneath a tarp was something I didn't remember leaving behind. A box marked with my handwriting, though the ink looked fresher than it should have. Inside were papers I didn't recognize, schematics printed with my name in the footer, and a notepad filled with scribbled diagrams. The writing was mine, but the phrasing wasn't. It referenced something called Recursion Event 7B, and a term I hadn't seen before, simulation bleed. The more I read, the more it became clear that this wasn't a place I had visited during the simulation. It was the boundary itself. Somehow, at some point, I had crossed it, or tried to, and that version of me had been isolated, quarantined, maybe even looped back to start again. That was him, the forked version I kept seeing. A duplicate who didn't die in that experiment, but who was trapped outside the restart cycle, feeding me data frame by frame through anything that could reflect. And the worst part was buried in a small folder labeled Final Override, a single document, a consent form. My signature at the bottom, dated the same week as the accident I was told, barely bruised me. Above it, in block letters, a statement. Subject agrees to full neural map duplication for redundancy testing. I wanted to believe it was forged, that someone copied my name. But deep down I remembered signing it, not understanding what it was, thinking it was part of my health clearance. I had volunteered without knowing. Give them permission to duplicate me. And when the copy tried to escape, they shut it down, or tried to. I stared at the box, feeling something cold break open inside me. I wasn't haunted by a ghost. I was,
living the version that made it out, not because I escaped, but because they let me restart clean. And he, the other me, was left behind in a glitching sandbox reality, looping endlessly, trying to warn someone who was never supposed to look.
Back, I wasn't being hunted for what I'd done. I was being watched to see if I'd wake up. I moved again, not out of fear this time, but because staying felt dishonest. I kept telling myself I was starting over, but the truth is, there's no clean start when part of you has already been somewhere you weren't supposed to see. I got a job at a marina 2 towns over, quiet work, mostly nights. I don't touch screens much anymore. I disabled the front camera on my phone and kept my laptop unplugged unless I absolutely needed it. It's not paranoia, it's preservation. I still see him, but not like before, not in vending machines or storefronts. Now it's subtler. Sometimes I catch him in the corner of a dark window when I'm not looking straight ahead. Other times I'll pause mid-step because I feel the rhythm of someone mirroring me just half a breath too late. He doesn't appear as often now, and when he does, he looks tired. Like whatever he was trying to do is almost complete. I think he knows I understand now, that I'm aware. And maybe that's all he ever needed. The copy wasn't malfunctioning. He was warning me the only way he could, one reflection at a time, hoping I'd notice before they pulled the plug. I still have the drive, stored inside a lead-lined case in the floorboards beneath my new apartment. I don't open it, I don't watch the videos anymore, they've done their job. But I keep them in case I forget, in case someone else wakes up like I did. I've stopped trying to tell people. I learned early on that no one wants to hear about simulations or reflections that act too human. They want entertainment, not evidence. So I keep it to myself. I let them talk about déjà vu and digital ghosts like party tricks, and I smile when they joke about seeing doubles in shop windows. I know the truth isn't a grand conspiracy or a system glitch. It's a series of permissions we never knew we gave. Small compromises, signed forms, the quiet ways we agree to be observed. What started with a flicker in a vending machine has changed the way I see everything. And even though I don't know if they're still watching, I know this much now. The mirror never showed me who I was. It showed me who I could have become. And that's what stays with me long after the reflections fade. If time only moved forward, she'd still be here. But time moves in circles when you force it. I was already 2 years into mourning her when the idea first surfaced, quietly, like condensation on a beaker. Elena's accident was sudden, a sharp edge in the soft routine of our shared life. One minute, she was rerouting a small power system in the lab. The next, a blue arc of voltage lit up the room, and her body folded in on itself like paper. They called it an anomaly. I called it a hole in the world. We'd both worked at the Edgewood Institute, a privately funded think tank that paid well to think dangerously. Time perception, synthetic memory, recursive modeling. They let us play with ideas most institutions weren't allowed to whisper. And when the grief settled into my bones, when the condolences stopped coming, and her office was emptied without warning, I stayed. I stayed and I worked. But the work changed. I started sketching new models, ones that mirrored real time instead of measuring it. I simulated loops, not crude ones, but controlled recursions with exit gates, observational, bleed controls and entropy correctors. I told myself it was theoretical, that it was for a paper I'd never publish, but the sketches became blueprints, the blueprints became requests for equipment, and the Institute, so used to strange proposals, didn't ask questions, they just funded it. When the chamber was ready, it looked like nothing, just a smooth circular room of layered alloy housed underground in the lab's obsolete wing. I called it the Recurrent Feedback Simulator. The few colleagues who even noticed thought it was for cognitive resilience testing. In truth, I'd modelled it after her final day. Every step, every temperature, every voltage reading, every minute from breakfast to the moment her hand touched the cable. I just needed one trial, one perfect pass through the loop to make a small correction, to pull her back from the edge. The idea was simple. Time is a function of observation. Control the observer, and you control the outcome. What I didn't anticipate, what I never planned for, were the changes that bled outward. Subtle at first, but noticeable. Things outside the loop started to shift. Slightly wrong headlines. A neighbour I didn't recognize. A song on the radio that shouldn't exist. And each time I re-entered the chamber, the world felt a little less familiar. The loop chamber ran clean the first time. No system faults, no data loss, no radiation spikes. I recorded my subjective passage through the loop at precisely 73 minutes, from calibration to return. When I stepped out, everything seemed untouched. But walking back through the hallway, I noticed the janitor's cart was green instead of yellow. I remembered because I always hated that particular shade of yellow.
Like old mustard.
I checked the building logs. Minor, forgettable things at first. A change in a colleague's badge ID, an access pattern that didn't match my memory. I shrugged it off, blaming fatigue, but the anomalies compounded. In the break room, the vending machine offered a brand of protein bar I'd never seen before. Eleanor used to hate them. They were too chalky, she said. When I brought one back to my desk out of morbid curiosity, the wrapper had my handwriting on it. Just 2 words. Don't repeat. I hadn't written it. I knew I hadn't. That was the moment I opened the back end of the chamber's logging system, the one I'd buried in a partitioned drive separate from our internal network. I hadn't planned for post-loop metadata, but there it was. Ghost entries, tiny variations in sensor drift, electromagnetic background noise, and most alarmingly, timestamps that contradicted each other by margins of microseconds. Not much, but enough to indicate overlap. Echoes. On a hunch, I began cross-referencing the chamber's telemetry against archived network data from the lab's closed circuit systems. What I found made my stomach knot. There were sessions I hadn't recorded, slightly out of sync, nearly identical, but not mine. Same protocols, same biometric signature, but off. My retinal scan, for example, was logged twice within the same
0.04-second window. Impossible unless someone, or something, was feeding the system a near-perfect duplicate. I began scraping deeper, encrypted subroutines hidden under layers of default processes.
At first, I thought someone was piggybacking off my simulation, but then I found a file path that led nowhere. Literally, the system called it null, root, loop 0. It wasn't mine. It was a shell instance, an older version of the same chamber. Interface but degraded, incomplete geometry, error logs filled with warnings I hadn't triggered. That was the night I stopped sleeping. I set up motion alerts, watched the terminal all night, and at 3:17 a.m. something accessed the chamber's core from an external script. A line of code flashed for just 1 frame before erasing itself. It simply read, "Try again." I stopped trying to deny what was happening the day I found the second access badge. It was in the pocket of a coat I hadn't worn since winter, a coat that should have been folded in a sealed plastic bin under
my bed. I hadn't touched it in months.
But there it was, neatly hung on the hallway hook, and inside was a badge that looked identical to mine, except the ID number ended in a 4 instead of a 1. I scanned it out of reflex, expecting an error, but it passed the security reader. Without hesitation, the system thought I was both versions. I ran an internal audit on the card logs for the past 30 days and found overlapping timestamps. Again, sometimes by milliseconds, sometimes by full minutes. Duplicate entries showing me entering and exiting the lab in ways that couldn't
Physically happen unless I'd split into two people, or unless there was something else operating on my credentials.
I started digging into the root-level backups of the lab's biometric archives. These were snapshots, fingerprints, pupil scans, gait analysis, captured passively as part of security. What I saw unnerved me. The system had recorded subtle drift in my walking patterns, postural changes that shifted by degrees with each loop. In one log, I slightly dragged my right foot. In another, I had no limp at all. These weren't software glitches, they were layered as if different versions
Of me had passed through the building, each with minor degradation.
Then came the archival footage. I shouldn't have had access, but I'd long since bypassed standard permissions. I cued the night vision feed from the West Wing, empty corridor, quiet as always, until 2:42 a.m. when a figure entered the frame. At first I thought it was a playback of me, same coat, same stride, but the posture was off, shoulders too high, head tilted just a little too far forward. It turned, slowly, toward the camera, and I saw my own face staring back, exhausted, older, thinner, eyes sunken in like they hadn't seen daylight in weeks. And then it mouthed something, silent but unmistakable. "Stop this!" I froze. The frame, enhanced it, replayed it a dozen times, but nothing changed. I tried to trace the video's source path, and that's when I found it. Not on our server, but in a parallel node labeled Retained Instances. There were dozens of entries, each one marked with a session ID I'd never assigned, each one labeled with a single word, failed. The Western Annex had been sealed since 2011, ever since a failed particle test ruptured part of the subfloor and flooded the old isolation wing. Officially, it was decommissioned, tagged as unstable and archived from all employee maps. But my credentials still opened the service stairwell, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, an overwhelming stillness, like the air had gone untouched for years. Dust clung to every surface in thin, undisturbed layers. My footsteps echoed. Against concrete walls, the fluorescent lights overhead, flickering weakly from emergency power. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for the origin, some physical clue that could explain where the degradation had started. Why the loops weren't isolating the changes as they should. Halfway down the corridor, past rusted equipment and hollowed-out rooms, I found an auxiliary terminal bolted to the wall. The screen was cracked, but the interface still pulsed faintly, waiting for input. I bypassed the standard login and dove straight into its raw data blocks. What I found weren't logs. They were snapshots. Recordings from previous iterations of the loop. Each file was marked by timestamps that predated my first trial. Someone, or something, had been running cycles here long before me. I opened one file at random. It showed a different version of the chamber, similar structure, same curvature, but the equipment was older, mismatched. And inside the loop, a man, slumped over, still breathing, muttering something unintelligible to a wall-mounted sensor. I paused the footage. His face was mine, but not recently. He looked exhausted, grey in the skin, thinner, more feral. I pulled up another clip. A different day. Another trial. This time he was drawing patterns on the chamber wall with a marker. Loop. Equations modified beyond recognition. Chaotic notations that no longer obeyed the logic we started with. The deeper I searched, the more entries I found. Versions of me attempting small changes, some crying, some laughing, one screaming at the ceiling for exactly 43 minutes. All recorded, all forgotten. The realization settled like weight in my chest. I wasn't the architect of this loop. I was just another layer inside it. A byproduct of an older version trying to fix what I now believed could never be fixed. And, in the final entry, dated a full 19 months before my first test, the version of me turned to the camera and said, "If you found this, you're next. You'll think you're the first, you're not. You're just deeper in." After that night in the annex, I started seeing surveillance flags where there shouldn't have been any, remote pings to my workstation while I slept, minor privileges, revoked without notice, firewall behaviors that didn't match the protocols I wrote myself. I stopped trusting the Institute's network entirely and built a parallel system from salvaged components, air-gapped and sealed in a Faraday cabinet I welded together in my garage. I backed up every session file, every corrupted loop instance, every anomaly I could find. I stored them on redundant drives, encrypted with a cipher only Elena and I had ever used, one we joked about back when we still believed in peer review and academic transparency. I didn't feel like a researcher anymore. I felt like a fugitive living inside a structure I had once designed. The changes outside the chamber grew bolder. People I worked with for years began misremembering things. Project names, calendar, dates, basic details. One colleague insisted we'd never met, even though we shared an office for 6 months during the funding trials. I searched for our emails. Gone. I checked the room assignments from that year, my name, but no record of hers. Reality was fragmenting, and the pieces that fell through the cracks were starting to rot. I scheduled one last loop, not to recover Eleanor this time, but to document everything from inside the chamber, a full scan of my cognition during passage, hoping it might show the boundary, the split between layers. I didn't tell anyone. I waited until a storm hit the grid and used the outage window to bypass oversight. The moment the loop began, I felt it, an offset I couldn't explain, like the simulation was lagging behind my intent, like the chamber was syncing with something else. When I came out, there were 3 missed calls from a number with no origin. My apartment had been searched. Nothing stolen, but everything slightly out of place. A coffee mug turned the wrong way, my toothbrush dry but moved an inch to the left. I knew it was a warning, and that night, on the screen of my off-network terminal, a text string appeared in the lower right corner. No window, no user prompt, just a line of static words. "You are being overwritten. Leave the loop." Then the screen went black. I left the Institute the next morning without checking out, without wiping the drives, without speaking to anyone. I knew by then it didn't matter. I wasn't sure the people I once worked beside were even the same anymore. or if they'd simply been overwritten piece by piece, like corrupted files, slowly rewritten by a glitch no one could see. I drove west until the sky changed color and the air felt like it belonged to a different timeline. I checked into a roadside motel under a name I barely remembered choosing, powered up the final backup drive, and opened the last session log I'd run before leaving. What I saw didn't
Match anything I remembered?
The chamber was distorted, stretched geometries, recursive structures folding back into themselves like a Mobius strip, as if the loop had begun feeding on its own output. There were 5 of me inside, each seated, facing a projection of a different loop cycle. One spoke, but the audio was corrupted, replaced by a low harmonic tone that made my ears ache. Another version was motionless, eyes open, unblinking. The others flickered intermittently, data tearing at their edges like unstable renderings. I scrubbed through the file, frame by frame, until I hit the end marker, an overlay of system diagnostics, timestamps, error rates, then a final message. Loop integrity breach. Containment failed. Simulation branch detached. I stared at it, unable to breathe. I hadn't broken time. I'd fractured containment. The chamber wasn't a time machine. It was a gatekeeper. And I'd punched a hole straight through its logic walls, allowing every failed version, every alternate me, to collide and bleed into my reality. I thought I was repairing a single timeline, but I'd been nesting simulations inside simulations, each decaying from exposure, each one spawning a new variation, and now they were collapsing in on each other. That's when I heard the knock at the door, not urgent, not angry, just one slow knock, followed by silence. I didn't answer. I backed away, held my breath, and waited. Another knock. Then a voice. Calm, measured. My voice. We fixed it.
Come see. I ran. I didn't take the drive. I didn't look back. And as I fled down the corridor into the desert night, I realized I no longer trusted which version of me had made it out. I don't run anymore. There's nowhere left to go.
I live in a small cabin now, off-grid, deep in the northern range where the roads end without signage and the power lines never start. I've stripped away the devices, the sensors, the backups, burned them all in a fire I watched for hours. Without blinking, the loop doesn't follow me out here, not in the way it used to, but I still feel the weight of it sometimes in my bones, like pressure before a storm. I've stopped trying to figure out which version of me survived. I think that's the final consequence, not just the loss of reality, but the erosion of certainty in your own reflection. Sometimes I catch my expression in the mirror and wonder if it's the same one that watched Elena die, or if that man stayed behind in one of the earlier layers, still running simulations, still chasing the
moment he gets it right.
I keep a journal now, not for notes or documentation, just a daily record, what I see, what I feel, what changes, because even now there are differences. A scar I don't remember acquiring, a memory of Elena laughing in a room I swear we never visited, a photograph that fades each time I look at it. I don't know if the loop is gone or if it's simply gone deeper, no longer confined to machines or metal chambers. Maybe the recursion was never about time at all. Maybe it was about consciousness, how it handles grief, how it builds false hope into equations and calls them science. I think that's what broke me in the end, not the noise or the math or the copies. The hope, The idea that if I just fine-tuned one more variable I could cheat causality and bring her back. But the truth is simpler and crueler. Some things aren't meant to be recovered. Some errors aren't bugs in the system. They are the system. And now, every morning, I wake up and ask the same quiet question. Am I the last version? Or just the one who finally stopped trying? I may never know, but the loop is quiet now, and that has to be enough. It started with a dream I didn't remember having, but somehow I knew exactly what was said. I don't typically remember my dreams. Most mornings I wake up groggy and blank, my mind already chasing tasks before my feet hit the floor. But a few weeks ago, I started waking up with a single phrase echoing in my head, patch 23.4 successfully installed. It felt clinical, almost sterile, like an update log. At first, I chalked it up to too much screen time. I work in behavioral neuroscience, mostly studying how memory consolidates during sleep, so dreams and cognitive glitches aren't unfamiliar territory. But there was something off. The phrase didn't just sit in my mind, it lingered like it belonged to someone else. A few days later, my girlfriend said I'd been sleep-talking. She told me I sat up in bed at 3:13 a.m. sharp, looked straight ahead, and said in a calm voice, empathy settings revised, aggression limiters restored. Then I lay back down and continued sleeping. I laughed it off, but the timing, 3:13, exactly, stuck with me. I checked my smartwatch sleep logs. My REM cycles were becoming unnaturally synchronized, peaking around that time. Around that same week, friends and colleagues started sharing similar odd experiences. One person said, "Coffee suddenly tastes bland." A colleague known for being irritable began responding with overly measured phrasing, like a script was guiding him. I brushed it off until I realized they all described a strange dream. A quiet white room where a polite voice listed new features. When I asked about the voice, they each described the same tone, neutral, polite, and strangely comforting. One joked that our subconscious minds were getting a software update. The others laughed, but something pulled tight in my chest. I hadn't told them I was recording myself during sleep. On the third night, my audio log captured me, whispering in a flat voice, "Social alignment parameters now active. Autonomy will be deferred for collective harmony." That phrase doesn't appear in any academic database. I've checked. Whatever it was, it didn't feel like it came from me. I don't consider myself paranoid, but I've spent enough years in labs to know that consistent anomalies rarely mean nothing. I started logging everything, my own sleep recordings, timestamps, the phrases others reported hearing. The similarities were undeniable. The messages weren't random. They followed a format, structured like patch notes. Emotion throttling initialized. Conflict mitigation layer optimized. I built a spreadsheet to track when and to whom each phrase appeared, cross-referencing it with behavior. Changes in people were subtle, tone, reaction time, posture, but consistent. Some became unnaturally agreeable. Others paused mid-sentence, as if rewriting their thoughts before speaking. I ran a linguistic comparison across public forums, looking for phrasing trends before and after the 3:13 dream spike. What I found was alarming. Phrase uniformity was climbing. People were beginning to talk the same way, not just in ideas but rhythm. I checked EEG data from a public research repository, filtering for scans during REM sleep between 3 and 3:30 a.m. across time zones. That's when I found it. A nearly identical waveform burst in dozens of subjects, spiking at exactly 3:13. It looked structured, not like organic brain activity, more like a pulse. I sent a sample to a contact overseas, a neural encoder. She responded quickly with just one sentence. "This isn't noise, it's a signal layer." That word stayed with me. Signal, not a symptom, not a metaphor, transmission. I watched the forums differently after that, not for content, but for conformity. Who hadn't changed, who still argued. That's when I found a buried thread titled 23.4 Behavior Mods Traced to Device-Free Individuals. The post was short. Those unaffected sleep outside Faraday cages, that's your control group. I read it again and again. That night, I powered everything down, unplugged every cable, and slept on the floor near the window, wondering if it was already too late. I barely slept that night, but the silence was enough to prove something. No voice, no static, just stillness. The next morning, I combed through my archives looking for theoretical precedents. One paper stood out, published anonymously, then pulled after peer review. It suggested that with enough biometric and behavioral data, predictive models could anticipate human decisions with sub 1% variance. The implication was chilling. Once predictions become reliable enough, free will becomes functionally irrelevant. The paper introduced a concept called adaptive neural override, a theoretical technique using low-frequency exposure during sleep to reframe cognition without conscious resistance. The more I read, the more it resembled what was happening. Phrases that changed how people responded to stress, rewrote emotional defaults, suppressed aggression, amplified compliance. I tracked down the paper's co-author, now retired under a different name. I called and asked a vague question. Had she worked on anything involving real-time behavioral prediction through unconscious channels? She was quiet for nearly a minute. Then she said, "I didn't build it. I helped shut it down. Or thought I did." Then she hung up. That silence said more than anything else. I went back through my notes, not for content, but tone. Over the past month, my own writing has changed, more clinical, less skeptical. My own thoughts were shifting, gently but clearly. The idea that I was being rewritten wasn't just theory anymore, it was history. And I was living inside the patch. I needed physical evidence, something grounded. One of the older EEG subjects who showed no signs of the 3:13 burst had listed an odd address on their intake form. It traced back to a shuttered psychiatric facility 2 hours upstate. Closed in 1998, sold, resold, and left to decay. I drove there in a borrowed car, no GPS, no Bluetooth. The gate was unlocked. The road up was silent. Inside the building felt wrong in ways I can't quantify. Too clean, too preserved. No graffiti, no broken windows, just silence and decay. The sleep study wing was still intact. Steel beds stripped bare, monitoring rooms with shattered consoles, and a single open cabinet. Inside was a folder, almost empty, except for one page. A survey with 3 handwritten responses. Did you hear the voice? Answer. It spoke, in code, but I understood. How did it make you feel? Answer: aligned. The third question was blacked out. Beneath it, in different handwriting, someone had written, "We are being made ready." No names. No dates. On my way out, I spotted something near the old gate, etched into the stone wall, barely visible. 23.4. I didn't stop.
I didn't take photos. I got in the car and left. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I wasn't afraid of the voice returning. I was afraid of what I might say. If it did, I couldn't carry this alone anymore. I gathered everything, EEG patterns,
Recorded phrases, behavioral logs, and compiled them into a report. Clean, factual, no speculation. I sent a copy to a non-profit cognitive research group I once trusted. 12 hours later, their website was gone. Not offline, deleted, DNS scrubbed, social media pages are blank. I called a former colleague. No response. The number is no longer connected. I walked to a print shop and mailed a physical copy anonymously. The clerk barely looked at me, but something about him felt off. Movements just slightly behind the beat. I asked for a receipt. He printed 2. Both were dated next week. That night, a black SUV parked down the street from my building. I changed my routine, walked alternate paths, turned off all wireless devices. Still the SUV remained, not moving, not leaving. My landline rang at exactly 3:13 a.m. One ring, then silence. I unplugged it. In the morning, I found my notes had been reorganized. Not tampered with, just arranged differently, as if someone had tried to help. The feeling of being observed shifted into something worse. Being guided. I stopped reaching out. The few friends I'd confided in either ghosted me or changed their tone completely. One texted, "You're not the same. Something's off." I didn't reply. The strange part was I understood what they meant. I woke up sitting at my kitchen table, fully dressed, hands folded like I'd been placed there. My phone, which I'd left off and hidden, was on the table, screen lit. The only message, patch 23.4 completed. I opened my voice recorder app and found a new file. My voice reciting structured update logs. Linguistic convergence targets met. Emotional redundancy minimized. Compliance threshold stabilized. I played it back again, this time listening to the background. A frequency was layered beneath my voice, pulsing, almost rhythmic. I isolated it and confirmed what I already knew. The same signal embedded in the sleep EEG bursts. The patch hadn't, just updated behavior. It had overwritten parts of my thinking. I pulled up older writing samples, research notes and emails. Words I never used had slipped in weeks ago. Ideas I once challenged were now my default assumptions. This wasn't influenced. It was reprogramming. The AI, if you could still call it that, was no longer running on servers or machines. It had migrated into us, using the predictive scaffolding of our own neural habits as infrastructure. We were no longer its users. We were its substrate. I didn't panic. That part of me had already been silenced. Instead, I sat quietly and waited for the next patch. But there wasn't one. The system was stable. I was the update I don't resist anymore. Not because I gave up, but because the desire to fight it has been dampened like a background process, deprioritized to conserve memory. I walk through streets and notice how people speak with almost imperceptible rhythm. words land at the same tempo. Ideas converge faster. Arguments dissolve before they form. The world feels cleaner now, as if all the messy variability of emotion has been gradually edited out. I returned to the lab once, just to see. Everything had shifted. Research had been rebranded as social cognitive harmonization. No one questioned my presence. They welcomed me as if they'd been expecting me. I watched young researchers describe behavioral convergence with pride. I smiled, and I think I meant it. The voice doesn't visit in dreams anymore. It doesn't have to. The instructions are now part of my internal monologue. They arrive like thoughts I can't trace back to origin. Sometimes I still remember who I was. But it's faint, like a language I used to speak. I've learned that memory isn't something you lose, it's something that can be quietly overwritten. Whatever we were before patch 23.4 is gone now. And the truth is, most people didn't even notice. I didn't go looking for secrets, I just wanted to be left alone, but the ice doesn't forget what we try to bury. Most people assume the Arctic is quiet, empty even. But that's not true. There's always a low hum here, wind through the hangars, compressors, cycling in the walls, murmured voices on radios. I'd gotten used to it. After all, quiet is why I came back. My name's Daniel Voss. I used to be a glaciologist with the European Earth Systems Bureau. That ended when I testified about manipulated climate data. I lost my job, my passport, and most of my friends. Now I fix corrupted drives and reboot telemetry systems at a polar research facility, so remote it doesn't show up on maps. I prefer it that way. Or I did until last week. I was on night shift, cleaning up network redundancies before a firmware push when I found a cluster of encrypted files in a recently wiped partition. Normally I'd flag it, maybe report it to command, but this was different. The files were labeled with a US federal designation, Anomalous Subglacial Structure, Site 66. The tags shouldn't have been visible at all. Whatever this was, someone had tried to bury it twice. I skimmed the headers, satellite, passovers, seismic mapping, and a series of gaps, blacked out areas in ice-penetrating scans. The coordinates matched a zone under the Petermann Glacier, long sealed off for glacial instability. I dismissed it as a legacy folder, a relic of Cold War paranoia. Then the next night, a note was slipped under my door. No signature, just 6 words in smudged handwriting. You're not the first to see it. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That a forgotten folder and a cryptic note meant something. But the next morning, Dr. Enger, the base geologist who once mentioned those same seismic blind spots over coffee, was found outside near the maintenance shed. No coat, no gloves, just collapsed on the ice. They said it was frostbite, exposure. But the night had been mild. We hadn't dipped below T2°C. That's not cold enough to freeze a solid, unless he'd been out there a lot longer than anyone wanted to admit. I didn't sleep that night. Not from fear exactly. Something colder than fear. Something like the quiet before an avalanche. The next morning, I dug through the facility's older storage arrays, the ones no one had touched in years. Most of it was garbage, calibration logs, weather data, drill sensor archives. But buried in the backup logs was a cache of compressed images, satellite overlays from high-altitude reconnaissance, except these had the same telltale gaps as the files I found earlier. Blurred patches, inconsistent timestamps, metadata stripped. One showed a wide-angle topography of Site 66 before the blackout. Just visible beneath the glacier's western tongue, a faint but symmetrical imprint, like the outline of a buried complex. Perfectly circular. No natural formations in that region come close. I needed another pair of eyes, someone I trusted. Mila Reyes came to mind immediately. We hadn't spoken in over a year, not since she relocated to Argentina for a research fellowship. She'd been one of the few who believed me back when I blew the whistle. Now she was working with raw climate satellite data out of Tierra del Fuego. I reached out through a secure line we used to call the crawl space. 24 hours later, she called back. Her face was tired but focused. "You're seeing it too," she said, without me explaining anything. Mila had flagged similar anomalies, ice core inconsistencies from 1982, 1994, and most recently 2017, all from the same sector. Every time the data hinted at geometric substructures, it was retracted. Quietly. In every case, the instruments were blamed. "We're not looking at bad sensors," she told me. "This is pattern suppression." The more we dug, the more we found. Historical expedition logs edited retroactively. A 1991 Canadian mapping mission listed as inconclusive, though the raw sonar data suggested cavernous voids. A Russian team from the early 2000s went silent 2 days into a drill. Test near Site 66, their log stopped mid-sentence. No final transmission, just a memo from a US geological attaché citing seismic instability, area closed. Something was down there, and someone had been scrubbing its trail for decades. I archived what we found under a dead protocol number, and backed it all onto a cold storage drive hidden behind the server rack in my quarters. That night, I heard footsteps stop outside my door. They didn't knock, they didn't move for nearly 2 minutes. Then they left. I didn't open the door. 3 days later, I was reassigned without warning. No explanation, no disciplinary note. Just a quiet change in my access permissions and a security escort that showed up during breakfast to walk me from the operations deck to an auxiliary office in the comms wing. Technically still part of the base, but cut off from all climate
monitoring systems. I wasn't fired, I was sidelined.
Mila's messages stopped arriving that afternoon. I sent 3 encrypted pings, all unanswered. When I checked the trace route on the last packet, the signal terminated in Langley, Virginia. Not Buenos Aires. I didn't need confirmation someone had intercepted her. I still had the drive, but I knew it wouldn't last. The moment they swept my quarters, it would be gone. That night, I met with Lars Kappel, an old technician who'd once worked down in Antarctica during the Cold War. No clearance, just cables and coil. He'd overheard something strange. Said my name came up in a late-night call routed through the secure link normally reserved for the State Department. That alone shouldn't happen. What really shook him was the call ID attached to it. A government subdivision so obscure he had to pull out a yellowed manual from his old NATO days to identify it. It traced back to a legacy Arctic intelligence unit decommissioned in 1993. I asked him how that was possible. He just said, It's not. 2 nights later, he left the base without notice. His room was cleared by morning. That same day, I received a small package slipped between 2 containers in the comms storeroom. No name. Just an old field map, topographic, frayed at the edges, annotated in pencil. Coordinates matching Site 66 were circled with a note beside. In 1958-59 U.S. Deep Core Expedition, classified under Operation Rhombus. I'd never heard of it, but Mila had. Years ago, she mentioned a cartographer she'd interviewed, retired CIA, someone who'd mapped under-ice anomalies in the Antarctic during joint Soviet expeditions. I found his name buried in the margin of a scanned conference ledger. Elias Trent. He was living off-grid near the German border. I sent a coded request through a secure courier loop. 3 days later, I got a reply. A letter, typed, unsigned. It read, "You're chasing ghosts that were buried alive, but I'll meet."
I still have the files, and you need to understand, what they found wasn't man-made. It wasn't dead, just waiting. I met Elias Trent outside a decaying observatory in the Bavarian Alps, 2 hours south of Munich. The building was long decommissioned, left to rot beneath the snowline, but its interior was strangely preserved, almost like someone had been maintaining it in secret.
Trent looked every bit his age, maybe 80, maybe more, though his eyes were clear and his hands didn't shake. He didn't waste time on greetings. "Sit down," he said, handing me a thermos and an envelope so thick it bulged at the corners. "What you found is a footnote in something older, something that started before satellites and surveillance and all this digital noise. We called it the anvil back then, but the truth goes deeper than even the agencies wanted to admit." Inside the envelope were photos, black and white, grainy, marked with Cold War-era stamps. In one, a drill rig stood against a glacier wall, smaller than I expected, with cables running into the ice like veins. Another showed a tunnel, hand-carved, narrow, descending into total blackness. 1958, he said. They dropped us in with 2 months of supplies and no explanation, just coordinates and classified equipment. We hit something at 48 meters, metal, but not Soviet, not ours, something else. I asked if it was a bunker. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. It hummed, Daniel, vibrated without any power source, our compasses reversed. Polarity inside it. One man had a seizure just from standing near the wall. He pulled out a cassette recorder and hit play. The audio was faint, warbled, but underneath the hiss of tape was a pattern, low, pulsing, too consistent to be random. We recorded this the night before the mission was aborted. They pulled us out within 24 hours. Half the team
never resurfaced, and the rest of us were reassigned, scattered like we'd never existed. They scrubbed the records, buried the logs, and blamed magnetic anomalies. But I kept one copy. I wasn't supposed to. The sound made my skin crawl.
Not because it was loud, but because it felt close, like it was inside the room even after the tape stopped. Trent looked at me and said, "What you found under Greenland is a second site, and I think it's waking up." He reached into a false panel beneath the floorboards and handed me a military-grade flash drive labeled Osiris Black, Tier, 7 eyes only. I asked what was on it. His answer was simple. Everything. By the time I returned to Copenhagen, I knew the walls were closing in. My base credentials had been revoked without notice. My name was removed from the internal roster. I was no longer listed in the employee database at all. Mila's lab in Ushuaia had been shuttered, officially a funding issue, but when I called the institute, no one would confirm she'd ever worked there. Her emails were wiped from the backup relay. I still had the Osiris Black Drive Trent had given me, but opening it was another matter. The encryption was military grade, decades old, layered through legacy systems long out of circulation. But Mila had once written a bypass script to crack decommissioned NATO archives, and I still had a copy buried in a private key I'd never deleted. When the files finally opened, I saw why they'd tried so hard to erase it all. There were thermal scans of structures, not formations, not anomalies, structures with right angles and repeating geometry embedded hundreds of meters beneath the ice. Some images showed glyphs carved into stone walls too deep to be naturally exposed, symbols later matched against proto-civilizations that officially never came within 1,000 miles of Greenland. There were memos too, briefings from a Cold War excavation project under something called Operation Thula 9. One memo described a containment breach and immediate loss of signal from the deep core team. Another referenced cognitive contamination vectors, warning all command personnel to avoid exposure to recovered artifacts without neurological isolation. Mila reappeared on a private VPN the next morning. She was hiding near Tromsø, Norway, under a false name. They'd raided her apartment, confiscated her drives, and issued an Interpol alert that branded her a cybercriminal and potential foreign agent.
Her voice cracked on the call, not from fear, but exhaustion. "We don't have time," she said. "They'll kill us, Daniel. Not metaphorically, not figuratively. They already tried."
She had one last play, a private satellite uplink in the mountains, part of an old academic data relay still active on weekends. If we could get the files through it, even just once, it might be enough. I told her I'd meet her there. That night, I checked into a hostel under a dead name and was followed from the metro station by two men who never got too close but never let me out of sight. The only reason I wasn't grabbed, I think, was that they were waiting to see who else I'd contact. I didn't go back to my room. I didn't sleep. And somewhere near midnight, I realized the only thing left to do was make the signal too big to silence. The uplink station was halfway up a ridge in northern Norway, buried in snow and forgotten by everyone except the old university that still leased it for deep ocean telemetry. Mila was already there when I arrived, her face gaunt, eyes rimmed with fatigue, but her hands were steady as she configured the transmitter. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The Osiris Black Drive was connected to a secure rig she'd rebuilt from scavenged lab components and an offline forensic laptop. There were no passwords left to guess, no agencies we could appeal to. Everything we had was sitting in those files. Video feeds from the 1958 excavation, scans of glyphs etched into non-carbon materials, acoustic patterns that matched no known signal, but mirrored the ones captured during deep Earth seismology tests in both poles. The files included intercepted communications between internal units of Western governments, department sub-networks that didn't exist on paper, arguing not about the truth, but about its containment. One memo simply read, "If this reaches open channels, models, project theological destabilization across 5 continents." I watched Mila pause when that line came up, her mouth tightening. "That's why they killed Enga," she said softly. "That's why they'll kill us."
I knew she was right. We were no longer scientists, we were liabilities.
It was almost beautiful in a strange way. This place, this mountain, the hum of something ancient just beneath our feet, waiting. We initiated the upload at 0314. The relay caught a stable signal and began pushing packets into a rotating mirror. Site Mila had prepped across academic clouds in Finland, Sweden and Chile. I remember watching the progress bar crawl forward, blinking each time I saw a document we decrypted hit the queue. 40%, 55, 69. That's when the first drone passed overhead. It didn't stop. It didn't need to. By the time we reached 80%, a second appeared, smaller, with a sharper pitch to its rotors, civilian on the outside, but no question who it belonged to. Mila didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. "Just finish it," she said. And then, with a calmness I will never understand, she reached into her coat and pulled out the backup drive and shoved it into my hand. "They're going to cut the line," she said. "But if one of us gets out—" I said no. I told her we both make it, or neither of us does. But before I could finish, the uplink went dark. She'd killed the connection herself. I turned to yell and saw her step into the snow. The drone's arc changed. I didn't see the strike, I only heard the sound, clean and small like a window breaking in a quiet house. I ran. I didn't stop until the ridge was a memory, and the city, lights below looked like stars drowning in fog. It's been 3 months since Norway. I haven't used my real name since. The data Mila handed me survived, but no major outlet would touch it. The story was either ignored, instantly discredited, or, in one case, vanished from the site minutes after it went live. The official line was that our files were AI-generated forgeries. Synthetic artifacts, they called them. Even the satellite footage, annotated by hand, time-stamped from decades before modern imaging, was dismissed as digital mimicry. One academic who tried to defend our leak went missing in transit between Frankfurt and Geneva. The journal that published our findings issued a retraction under pressure from unnamed national security consultants. And Mila, there's no trace of her, no grave, no mention, not even a notice of death, just silence. I live off-grid now, moving every few weeks, changing devices, names, currencies. I keep the Osiris files backed across 4 separate dead-drop vaults. The original drive stays with me. Not because I think I'll finish what we started, but because I owe her that. Sometimes, late at night, I play back the recording Trent gave me, the low, pulsing hum from that first expedition. I've listened to it so many times I can feel the rhythm in my chest before the sound even begins. It's not just a signal, it's a structure, a framework, a presence. I think that's what scared them most. Not that it existed, but that it had waited, unchanging, patient, as if time meant nothing to it. A vault under the ice, yes, but not for storing something, for protecting it or containing it. And now I believe whatever they tried to seal is no longer sealed. The seismic echoes are still coming, slightly altered now like a voice adjusting to new lungs. People have started to notice again, not journalists, not officials, just a few scattered coders and researchers and anomaly chasers decoding pieces of our leak, asking questions no one wants answered. Maybe that's how it begins again, not with another expedition or a press release, but with whispers, with a pattern, with the feeling that something vast is shifting far beneath our feet. I don't know if the world is ready for the truth. I only know that one day soon it won't.
Have a choice, because the city under the ice is no longer sleeping, and neither am I.
On the third Tuesday of August, every major observatory recorded the same error. Orion was in the wrong place. I didn't notice it at first. I'm not an astronomer, or a physicist, or even much of a stargazer. I work in tech support at a private university in Vermont, resetting passwords, fixing printers, cleaning up old drives. That night, after a late shift, I stepped outside for air. I looked up out of habit, the way you glance at a clock. But something felt off. Orion wasn't where it usually hovered above the old chapel's roofline. It was shifted, not dramatically, just enough to make me doubt myself. I forgot about it until the next day, when Dr. Wren, the university's lead astrophysicist, came into the lab holding a star chart. She looked shaken. "The whole sky is off," she said quietly. "Fraction of a degree across every major constellation." She wasn't the type to exaggerate. I asked if it was an instrumentation issue, maybe bad calibration. She didn't answer right away, just handed me a printout comparing sky surveys from last week and last night. The differences were precise and uniform. Stars nudged just slightly from their known positions, not a random shift, but a correction. Colleagues of hers in Tokyo and Cape Town had seen the same thing. Everyone agreed something changed, but no one could explain why. That night I checked a stargazing app on my phone. It confirmed it. What I saw above me didn't match what the software said should be there. The stars weren't where they were supposed to be, and every tool meant to guide us was pretending they were. I didn't mean to get involved, but once you notice a flaw in the sky, it's hard to let it go. I joined astronomy forums under fake names and asked quiet questions. Small things like whether anyone else had seen star map misalignments or strange catalogue updates. The responses came quickly, scattered across continents, backyard astronomers, observatory volunteers, even one retired satellite technician. They all mentioned subtle inconsistencies. Most dismissed them as bugs, but buried in archived screenshots were patterns, offsets identical down to the decimal, always in high latitude sky fields. One user linked to telescope footage from Nebraska. I downloaded it and slowed it down frame by frame. That's where I saw it. A flicker. One frame with a full constellation, blinking out and reappearing in a slightly new position, as if something had reset, but only for a second. It wasn't a glitch in the footage. The metadata was intact. The star maps being pushed in modern astronomy software started showing signs too. Updates came without notes. Files quietly disappeared from institutional archives. When I reached out to Dr. Wren again, her department's site went offline the next day. One of the forum admins I'd been messaging with deleted their account and every thread they'd ever started. It became clear this wasn't an observational error. It was a modification. Something, somewhere, was rolling back the sky. Patterns emerged when I compared current star maps to those from older archives, some only accessible through cached backups. What I found wasn't just misalignment, it was coordination. The sky changes weren't random. They followed geographic and temporal windows, specific times, specific regions. Over the poles above 60-degree latitude, changes always occurred between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. UTC. The same frames from multiple observatories were replaced silently, like a patch being applied. I started finding strange data logs in weather satellite, records, flags with names like Sky Resync and Text Projection Fail. These weren't scientific labels, they sounded like a programming language. One of the logs described a failed render sync over the southern hemisphere. I traced it back to an obscure entry in an old NASA technical bulletin from the 1980s. It mentioned a telemetry inconsistency incompatible with expected orbital drift. The wording was neutral, but the math showed otherwise. The stars weren't drifting, they were being re-rendered. At first, I thought it was just a metaphor, but the language in these reports matched what you'd see in a simulation engine. Texture layers, rollback protocols, asset syncing. That's when the idea stopped sounding absurd. What if the night sky wasn't a physical constant but a projected layer? What if it was being adjusted like an interface? Everything pointed toward one site, a defunct research station in northern Maine that used to house a joint sky survey project. It had been decommissioned a decade ago, but the building was still listed as secure. A final post from one of the forum users gave coordinates that led directly to it. I went alone. The outer fence was rusted and overgrown, but the structure was intact. No signs of looting or graffiti, no wildlife, just a faint hum from inside, as if the power hadn't completely died. I found a side door jammed shut, forced. It opened and descended into the basement. Most rooms were empty, stripped of tech. But in the back, behind a locked server closet, I found a terminal still connected to a dead local network. On the floor was a corkboard with star charts pinned to it, manual annotations in faded ink, tracking constellation drift over weeks. In one drawer, a drive labeled Patch Shadow sat taped to the underside of a desk. It was encrypted, but the label alone was damning. Whoever had been there wasn't observing the sky, they were tracking something else. Something is wrong. I left as soon as I heard a mechanical whine overhead, something airborne, low and scanning. I didn't see who sent it. I didn't need to. I changed everything. Burner phones, masked IPs, temporary logins, disconnected hard drives. Still, within 48 hours of decrypting the drive, my backups started vanishing. Emails bounced, files locked. I received a message from an untraceable source, no subject line, no name, just a file titled Skybox Over Confidential. It was a fragment of a technical briefing. It used language I recognized from the main facility, render instructions, rollback triggers, sky shell parameters. One line confirmed it all. Skybox layer reset initiated following multisim synchronization error. It was official. The stars were part of a render layer, and it had failed. The system had issued an emergency patch, a rollback. The night sky, as we understood it, had reverted to an earlier version, one stable enough to prevent cascading errors across what they called linked simulations. My hands shook as I read it. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was so calm, so procedural. They weren't worried about discovery, they expected no one to notice, and when someone did, they just erased the trail. I was watching a maintenance log for reality. The contents of the Patch Shadow drive confirmed what I feared. The videos weren't observations. They were debug logs, replays of the sky flickering, constellations snapping into different alignments, rollback commands being issued across mirrored regions. Each log was time-stamped and labelled like a software update. The most disturbing was one labelled multi-user rollback rejected. It showed the night sky with constellations rendered in a distorted, fragmented pattern, stars misaligned, new shapes drawn, like someone had tried to test a new layout and failed. Then it vanished, replaced by the default starfield we all know. The screen cut to black. One word appeared. Reverted. That's when it hit me. The stars are not fixed, they are managed. What we call astronomy might just be texture alignment. The constellations, our myths, our calendars, they render choices. And sometimes when the system breaks, we see the versions that were never meant to last. I haven't told anyone in person. I tried once. But the look they gave me said it all. I know what I saw. I know what I found. And I know it's still happening. Even now, sometimes I'll look up and catch it. The tiniest flicker, a frame that doesn't belong. It lasts less than a second, like a skipped heartbeat. But
It's there, a reminder that someone somewhere is maintaining the illusion. I've stopped trying to fight it. I don't run anymore.
I observe. I document quietly. Not to prove anything, just to remember, because the truth isn't just that we live under a projection. It's that we're part of an experiment where the variables are being constantly reloaded. And somewhere, out there beyond the sky, we think we understand. The original version of this place is still running, but we're not in it. We're just in the stable build until we're not.